What's going on, guys? Today I wanted to bring you another one of my 2014 NAWCQ hat format decks. The deck I wanted to show off today is Traptrix Worms. It's a really cool deck, and there's a lot of different builds out there, so there's not really a specific standard build that you can go off of when looking into this deck. So the build that I personally play is very trap heavy and very control type. I almost like to compare it to Geargia in a lot of ways, and I'll kind of explain that as we move forward with this deck profile, but I've had a couple people ask me about this deck, and it is really cool. It's a lot of fun. It's very different from a lot of other decks, so let's get straight into this deck profile. So starting off with the monsters, I play 3 copies of Worm Kataros. This one kind of reminds me of a Geargia armor in the fact that it has the effect that when it's flip summoned, you can add a level 4 or lower reptile worm monster from deck to hand. So this one can search you basically any of your other level 4 worm monsters. The next worm we play is 3 copies of Worm Zex. This one is probably one of your better starters. In a way, this one kind of reminds me of like a Geargia Arsenal almost. What it does is when it's normal summoned, you can send a reptile type worm monster from deck to graveyard. And if you control a face-up Worm Yagan, this card cannot be destroyed by battle. So really, really good to send your Worm Yagan, which is the next worm that we also play 3 copies of. This one has a pretty cool ability. First off, it has 1800 defense, so it is pretty large. And its effect is if the only other monster you control is Worm Zex, you can special summon it from your graveyard in face down defense position. So really cool to get an additional body on board. And then it also has the part of that effect where if it's removed from the field, you remove this card from play. But if you use it as, say, Xyz material, then it'll still go to graveyard. But the other effect that's really relevant is when this card is flipped face up, you can select a face-up monster your opponent controls and return it to the owner's hand. So it's really cool being able to summon the Worm Zex, send the Yagan, set the Yagan, and then when it's flipped face up, being able to basically compulse a monster your opponent controls. So that's really, really strong. And just as I said, kind of being able to recur that in a resource loop is really nice. The last worm I'm playing is 1 copy of Worm King. This one might seem a little out of place, but it'll make sense once we get into one of the trap cards. What this one does is you can tribute summon it by tributing a face-up reptile worm monster you control, and then you contribute one reptile worm monster to select and destroy 1 card your opponent controls. That's a soft once per turn, so if you have multiple worms to tribute off, you can use this effect multiple times in a turn. So that's really, really cool. Moving on to the Traptrix part of this deck, we play 3 copies of Mermail, obviously to search your whole normal trap cards, as well as on special summon pop back row, and the standard 2 Dionea, which can basically special summon back your in-graveyard Traptrix monsters, and then when it's special summon, it can reset your whole normal trap cards. So that's really good to make rank 4s, as well as, just get extra bodies on board. The last monsters I'm playing are 2 copies of Max C. This feels pretty standard if you've seen any of my other deck profiles. It's just a really good card to draw into more resources, especially in a deck like this that's a little slower and control heavy. Being able to slow down those combo decks is really important. And that's it for the monsters. Some people will choose to play the hands in this deck. I prefer to side them, and a kind of a cool thing you can do is, say, going into games 2 or 3, you can side out the Traptrix and put in hands, especially since your monsters like Worm Yagan, they set themselves, so you could in theory set a hand and they're going to expect it to be like a Yagan or just a Kataros or something like that, and then you can really catch them off guard with the hands. If you want to main them, you can, but like I said, this is a more trap heavy build. Moving on to the spells, 3 copies of Mystical Space Typhoon. Obviously, in a grindy type situation, you want to make sure that you can outgrind your opponent, as well as just popping their back row against artifact matchups and stuff, popping, their artifacts and cards on their turn so that they won't get the summons off of it is really good. 2 copies of Pot of Duality to just dig deeper for more resources in your deck. Because of Dionea and the whole Yagin and Zex loop, you do want to have your special summoning online, so I think just playing 2 copies of this is completely fine. 1 copy of Soul Charge, you don't really need more than that, because as I just mentioned with the Traptrix engine and the Worm engine, they kind of special summon themselves back in a lot of ways. So 1 is there just to, late game, or if you find yourself behind a little bit, push yourself to get back on track with that. And the last spell is 1 copy of Dark Hole to clear boards. After that, the biggest stack of the deck is the traps, because this is very trap heavy. We play 3 copies of W Nebula Meteorite. That's a bit of a mouthful to say, but this card is just insane. I don't know what more this card could really be for the deck. I'll pull it up here so you can see the full effect. It says, change all face-down monsters on the field to face-up defense position, and then during the end phase, this turn, change all face-up light reptile monsters you control to face-down defense position, then draw 1 card for each, and after that you can special summon 1 level 7 or higher light reptile monster from your deck. So the idea with this is when you would, say, summon your Worm Zex, send a copy of Worm Yagin, special the Yagin face down, set this, and then the idea is when your opponent starts kind of going off, you flip this, it flips up the Yagin, which will bounce a card from their field, which will then, because you have a face-up Yagin, this won't be able to be destroyed by battle. And so hopefully these will stay on the field, and when they do during the end phase, it will flip both of these down, resetting the Yagin, which is good. You'd be able to draw 2 cards and summon your copy of Worm King from deck. So just a really absurd card, really, really strong, kind of acting as a compulse plus draw power and almost like an E-Telly on top of that if you hopefully don't draw the king. After that, 2 copies of Breakthrough Skill. I kind of want to bump this to 3, but I already am over 40 cards because this is 41. There's a handful of changes that you could technically make, just depending on what you feel your matchups are worse with this deck. For me, I personally just only found the room for 2. Moving on, 2 copies of Phoenix Wing Windblast. I just wanted a good chainable trap that's good in almost any situation. And discarding, say, extra Mermelios to then have Dionea on board, basically. Or discarding extra Yagins if you have Zexes in hands is really nice. So it has a lot of utility. 2 copies of Dimensional Prison. Personally, I usually don't like the battle-style trap cards like Mirror Forces and D-Prisons and stuff in this format, just because as modern H.A.T format has evolved, a lot more people are playing back row removal and things, and just the artifacts generically have really good matchups against back row. But this deck, I think, against the hands, it helps this deck outgrind decks that are playing hands, as well as just outing some other threats, and it'll kind of make a little more sense in the extra deck for that reason. So I think D-Prison is really, really strong in this deck specifically. 2 copies of Wiretap, again, very similar to Geargia, where it just kind of has this grind game, and Wiretap being able to throw trap cards back and forth with your opponent is really good. After that, some one-ofs, 1 Traptrix Trap Hole Nightmare, 1 Bottomless, 1 Compulse, 1 Torrential, 1 copy of Offering to the Snake Deity. This card is basically like Icarus Attack, but for reptile monsters. it doesn't come up that often, which is why I think it's just a good one of, because usually you want to keep your, say, Worm Yagin or Worm Zex on field, so tributing it off isn't the best, but it is a good way to just clear extra cards, so I think it is a very good inclusion as a one of. And one solemn warning. If I were to cut something, I might cut back on, say, one of the D prisons. I think that's probably the one change in the main deck that I'm not, like, would be okay with, as I'm not the biggest fan of that card, as I previously mentioned. Moving on to the extra deck, one copy of Crazy Box. A lot of times putting up a 3,000 attack point monster and just setting a bunch of back row and protecting it is enough to outgrind your opponent. The effects also aren't that bad. Obviously, you don't want to roll a 1 on this card and have your life, and you don't want to roll a 6 and destroy itself. But the second, if you roll a 2, for example, drawing a card is good. 3, your opponent discards a card, that can be pretty good. 4, negating a face-up card your opponent controls, that's really good. And 5, destroying a card on the field, that's also really good. So overall, this card is really strong, and obviously it still has its utility against decks that play Skill Drain. One copy of Ragna Zero for decks that play tanky and stuff. One Constellar Omega, it needs 2 light monsters, and it basically makes so you detach a material during either player's turn, and then all Constellar monsters, usually just itself, are unaffected by other spell and traps this turn. Really, really cool. 2 copies of King of the Feral Imps to search your worm cards. 1 101, 1 Diamond Direwolf, 1 Starliege Paladynamo. This is another card that requires 2 lights. It's a really cool card. Once per turn, you can detach 2 materials from it, target a face-up monster your opponent controls. Its attack becomes 0, and its effects become negated. And then when it's destroyed by your opponent's card, by battle or card effects, and sent to the graveyard, you draw a card. So it's a good way to out opponent's big monsters, as well as gaining a little bit of advantage with a draw. 1 Exciton, 1 Bujinti Tsukiyomi has really big defense. It lets you discard your hand and draw till you have 2 cards. You have to minimally have 1 card to activate that effect in hand. But again, there's a lot of times where you just have 1 card, and gaining a little bit of advantage is nice. 1 Lavaval Chain in order to send your worms or Traptrix or anything else. 1 Daigusto Emerald, 1 Abyss Dweller, 1 Cowboy. This could also be Heartland Draco. In this deck particular, I just like Cowboy's utility. And lastly, 1 Rhapsody in Berserk to round out the extra deck. Anyways, hopefully you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, make sure to drop a like on the video, comment any questions you have about siding patterns, or if you want to see gameplay or any other sort of deck profiles or content in general, definitely let me know that in the comments section. And anyways, I will see you in the next video.